Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome to this episode of The Real Deal. I'm your host, Joshua Blakeney, and in this show, we'll be having the illustrious Jan Irvin back on The Real Deal. He's the first guest I've invited back again onto the show since I started recording episodes of The Real Deal, because he is such a polymath and is so well researched in the subjects that he addresses. You know, there's a lot of people in our movement who are very good at reading other people's books and summarizing their conclusions, which is very useful, of course. But Jan's one of those people who does the freedom of information requests, gets the documents from the CIA and so on, and does original research, which makes him a wonderful guest to have on the show. And in this show, we'll be discussing his latest article, which can be found on the homepage of his website, Gnostic Media, Gnostic spelt with a soft G, so GNOSTIC media.com. The article is entitled Entheogens, What's in a Name? The Untold History of Psychedelic Spirituality, Social Control, and the CIA. And Jan, so let me welcome you to the show first of all, and then perhaps you can explain to the listenership the main themes that you address in your exemplary article, which I enjoyed reading this morning.
Well, let's see. Well, first of all, thank you for the great introduction and all of that. And it's good to be back. It's good to be the first person to be on your show twice. And let's see. The main thesis of my article is how what we basically today call hallucinogenic or psychedelic or entheogenic drugs were renamed to market them intentionally to the youth and countercultures by the CIA in the 1960s. And through the documentation, we were able to prove essentially that it was the CIA that did intentionally launch the counterculture and the psychedelic revolution of the 60s. So that would be the main thesis. And then I actually break down and show how they did it using primary documentation. And I also show Dr. Timothy Leary's involvement in the MKUltra program, as well as Professor Carl Ruck of Boston University, who still teaches there to my knowledge, and a lot of other people like Aldous Huxley come to the forefront as a key architect of MKUltra. And in fact, MKUltra was funded the week that Aldous Huxley wrote Humphrey Osmond to get his first dose of mescaline before he wrote The Doors of Perception, which was the week of May 10 to roughly May 19, could be April 10 to April 19, 1953, and then the CIA officially funded the MKUltra program on the 13th.
So, just explain to the listeners, Jan, what's the official story of the emergence of the psychedelic movement and the official story of the MKUltra program as proffered by establishmentarian figures? Like, what would they, what would the CIA say if you said, "Well, what was your MKUltra program all about?" What would they say?
Well, they would tell everyone that the MKUltra program was about finding a Manchurian candidate, which is essentially a title that was put on the cover of John D. Mark's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. And that was basically a system of hypnotizing agent spies so that they could send them into other countries unaware that they were carrying a message. And then once at the other end, they would be re-hypnotized, the information pulled out of them, and then they could be woken up without ever knowing that they carried the message. So this was basically the Manchurian Candidate. And the official story from the CIA is that they really learned nothing from all of that. It didn't work. And, it was just a big waste of time. And that the CIA and that the MKUltra program was totally shut down, and the psychedelic drugs and everything were found to be worthless for what they wanted. And then continuing from there, the official story is that the psychedelics got out of the CIA's hands, that they were just, a bunch of a bunch of dupes and morons and idiots, and that there was all of this blowback. And So these things got out to the public and then created the psychedelic revolution, which thwarted the CIA's efforts.
And members of the psychedelic movement who I know you've liaised with or you've discussed this matter with, what would they say? I mean, they disagree with you, don't they? There are some people who celebrate the psychedelic movement as this great liberating phenomenon.
Well, you know, and I should say that I worked in the field of ethnobotany and ethnomycology for almost 20 years. I'm an author, so I'm sort of the, I don't want to say black sheep, because then I'd still be a sheep. It's something like, you know, to that effect, but the entire psychedelic community, all of the professors and doctors straight down the list that I used to work with have pretty much across the board stopped talking to me because I exposed this. Now, if you talk to them directly, they will make up all kinds of names, ad hominem attacks against me. Not one of them has actually ever addressed my work point by point. They will use red herrings, ad hominem attacks, appeals to emotion, but they won't ever address the work and the citations themselves. And so this, you know, and seeing a lot of these people do this stuff, especially starting in 2012 when I published my article on Gordon Wasson. Gordon Wasson, let's see, the man, the legend, the myth, back, what was it, in May or April 2012, I published that. But one of the things that really interested me when I published that article was all of my professor and researcher and author friends, and I must say that these are authors and researchers who know how to write things and go in and check citations. And yet I couldn't get any one of them to actually go in and look at the citations and verify them. None of them could say, Jan, you have this citation wrong here, and this is why. You know, they would name the sum of their argument was, Jan's gone crazy, ha, 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 end of discussion. And so, this is what is known as an ad hominem attack and an appeal to ridicule. You're basically, what you're saying is, what their argument was is that Jan is wrong because ha, 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 ha. That was the sum of their argument. And so this made me look at them more than anything else. And I started realizing, guys like James Fadiman, who was the last legal LSD researcher in the United States, he was involved in this cover-up. I found him working at the Harvard Social Relations Department, where a lot of these other guys came out of. And Dr. Henry A. Murray worked there. Timothy Leary worked there. Ralph Metzner worked there. Dick Alpert worked there. We have Dr. Thomas Chiu out of there. And so all of these guys coming out of this department, and then also surrounding the Millbrook Mansion, that is what really clued me into a lot of these guys were actually dirty and working with the program, and that the official story that we had been fed about the MKUltra program was completely fabricated so that the CIA and military intelligence community could lead the entire discussion so that they could control, the whole discussion that was going out to the public.
Yeah, because if people aren't addicted to drugs and alcohol and they're compos mentis, they're more likely to spot what's going on and figure out the conspiracies that take place among the elite and so on. And so rather than being liberating, this is more about stupefaction and dumbing down members of society so they won't be able to accurately perceive political and social reality in their societies, right?
Right, that's exactly right. And in fact, I have a quote in the article from Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who was in fact an MKUltra researcher, stating how the government can supply or restrict drugs to control the population. And then he talks specifically about the communes and hallucinogenic drugs and how it's best to let the communes exist, even though they're basically funded by welfare checks and family remittances, etc. And he says it's best to keep the communards out of the public and out of actually doing anything productive or being true activists. And as long as they're in these communes and doing nothing, they're out of the way. They're not a harm to the society. And so, we see this throughout especially in Aldous Huxley's literature. Aldous Huxley was adamant about promoting Soma, and in fact, Louis Jolyon West cites Aldous Huxley, and they were friends. But using this idea of Soma, or a narcotic, to stupefy and control the masses, to make them willful slaves, and completely unaware that they were slaves, essentially. And I'm just trying to pull up the quote here, so my apologies. My server seems a little slow today. Here we go. So let me just read this Jolyon West quote to you, and let's see. So Jolyon West says, the role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. Control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage for other types of control. An example would be the selective application of drug laws permitting immediate search or no-knock entry against selected components of the population, such as members of certain minority groups or political organizations. But a government could also supply the drugs to help control a population. This method, foreseen by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, has the governing element employing drugs selectively to manipulate the governed in various ways. To a large extent, the numerous rural and urban communes, which provide great freedom for private drug use and where hallucinogens are widely used today, are actually subsidized by our society. Their perpetuation is aided by parental and other family remittances, welfare and unemployment payments, and benign neglect by the police. In fact, it may be more convenient and perhaps more economical to keep the growing numbers of chronic drug users, especially of the hallucinogens, fairly isolated and out of the labor market with its millions of unemployed. To society, the communards with their hallucinogenic drugs are probably less bothersome and less expensive if they are living apart than if they are engaging in alternative modes of expressing their alienation, such as active, organized, vigorous political protest and dissent. The hallucinogens presently comprise a moderate but significant portion of the total drug problem in Western society. The foregoing may provide a certain frame of reference against which not only the social but also clinical problems created by these drugs can be considered. So this quote really lets the cat out of the bag in how the government uses and why they legalize some drugs or make them pseudo-legal, like, cannabis in California, et cetera. So this way that this is the way that they can control the population. And Marlene Dobkin de Rios, who is a professor of anthropology at Cal State Fullerton, she says that plant hallucinogens appear to have been used by regional religious and political leaders for control of political, psychological, and social arenas using the power made possible in drug-induced altered states. So this is really another key of how the MKUltra program actually used these psychedelic substances.
Yeah, and of course, when you proliferate drugs in a society, you then render drug users quasi-criminal, don't you? Because the state arguably could knock on the door of 1/3 of Canadians here in Canada, and they would be arguably arrestable. And so if people are addicted to drugs, that makes them fearful of the state and want to keep their head below the parapet and not question those in power in case those in power come after them for their drug use. So there's a psychological effect just the criminalization of drugs has upon people too, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's all different layers of psychological warfare, but what we're talking about right here doesn't even get to the core of how the CIA used psychedelics to create and control the entire 60s psychedelic revolution and counterculture. And that actually falls under hypersuggestibility. And we can actually follow the pattern of how these agents, and Tim Leary, Gordon Wasson, the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms. Gordon Wasson, he was actually the head of MKUltra Subproject 58, which became his famous May 13, 1957 Life magazine article that popularized magic mushrooms. But he was CIA. We know that Humphrey Osmond, who worked with Leary, was MKUltra Subproject 47. We know that Abram Hoffer and John Smithies and all of these guys. We know Al Hubbard. We know all of these guys were actually OSS, CIA, some of them were other military intelligence, but they were all involved in the program.
And if we broach the issue of eugenics and or dysgenics, how does that relate to this? I actually pilfered a quote from your wonderful article by Timothy Leary. He says, from Koestler, I learned about the juvenilization, the theory that evolution occurs not in the adult, in parentheses, final form, of a species, but in juveniles, larvals, adolescents, pre-adults. The practical conclusion, if you want to bring about mutations in a species, work with the young. Koestler's teaching about pediomorphosis prepared me to understand the genetic implications of the 1960s youth movement and its rejection of the old culture. So this was about
which of course Leary was actually behind, right? Leary created that, and so his statement there is actually tongue-in-cheek because he actually created that movement for the CIA, and then he's talking about it. It enabled me to understand the genetic implications of the 60s youth movement. He doesn't say, I already understood this and then applied it to the creation of the 60s youth movement, etc. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, like the Frankfurt School, there was this attempt to create a regulated rebellion that would encourage people to reject their traditions, the Western tradition. I know you, for example, have drawn attention to the importance of logic, which emerged out of Greek philosophy and the Western heritage.
Right. Well, not just logic. We focus on the trivium method, which is general grammar, Aristotelian logic, and classical rhetoric in that order, which is actually who, what, where, when, then why, then how, in that order. And so, this was key. They actually, I often tell people that mysticism is the tool of tyrants. And of course, this makes many people outraged. And it made me outraged the first time I heard it too. But I spent about 4 years thinking about it and couldn't find any exceptions. But when you understand that mysticism is the tool of tyrants and that they use the spirituality and all of these things to basically mislead people away from critical thinking and looking at the facts. It's like when you try to have a conversation with people today, if there's a contradiction, they go, oh, well, everybody's entitled to their opinions and we can't really know the truth. Whenever you see a contradiction in information, in logic and in the trivium method, this should alert you that there is either an error or a lie in the information and that you need to dig down further. You don't just throw your hands up and give up and go, I can't know. We can't know anything. Opinions are like, what. And so if we realize that contradictions are lies or errors, and if we also memorize the logical fallacies, this teaches us to actually go back down further into what is known as general grammar, not standard grammar like the putting sentences together properly, but general grammar is essentially the who, what, where, and when of a subject. It's gathering all of the knowledge, all of the information that's there, and you gather all of that up before you process it. And then the processing or the logic aspect, that's why. And then explaining to others exactly the steps you took to reach your conclusion, that's the how. So you have who, what, where, when, gathering the information, why is processing the information, removing contradictions and fallacies, and then how is explaining it. And so this is key, and they want to take people away from this process and tell people, like quantum physics is a huge con. These guys like Amit Goswami. I mean, Amit Goswami was even on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about how quantum physics was a religion, that nobody in the field agrees on what these things mean. I mean, the reason why none of them agree is because they're selling a religion, and it's just a cult, And if you try to get down into the facts of like the Copenhagen interpretation and all of this, you see that it's a total farce. Now, there is some value in some of the mathematics of quantum mechanics, but quantum physics is essentially a big kabbalistic fraud that was promoted by Albert Einstein and these clowns. Albert Einstein stole most of his theories from, for instance, the U.S. Patent Office when he worked there. And in fact, there's a very good book. It's like 2,800 pages, 2,600 pages by John Bjerknes, called The Manufacture and Sale of St. Einstein. But basically, quantum physics, they just took the Kabbalah and they repackaged it as a pseudoscience and then sold it to the universities and the public. But it's really there to keep people confused and to make you think that you can't trust your own five senses to look up facts. And, well, there's 11 dimensions. We can't know anything. Might as well just give up, And so you get all of this nonsense coming out of that. But when you understand the onus of proof and not arguing the arbitrary, the onus of proof means that if I make a claim, it's totally on me to provide all of the citations and evidence to support it. And if I don't provide it, it's known as arguing the arbitrary, and it's dismissed by default. Okay, so if I say, there's green aliens, coming down tomorrow, and I don't provide any evidence, it's dismissed by default. Now, some people might say, but what if there really are? Well, we can speculate all day long with no evidence about anything. But what happens is we waste our lives on speculation and not knowing anything. So if we stick to what we can actually verify and look for the facts on, then what happens is after several months, we begin to see how religions and cults and things use this area out of the commons. This is where we get common sense from. Out of the commons, or if you think of getting on the same page and verifying that the words, if you and I are looking at a book and we both turn to page 160, we both should be able to verify the exact words on that page, and then we can say, yep, it says that, it says that, it says that. That's getting on the same page, and we can verify exactly what it says. Like one person isn't going to be reading about dogs and cats, and the other person out of the same book going to be reading about quantum physics. But this is what, most of these New Agers and quantum physics pushers want people to believe, is that even if you went to a copy of the exact same book and looked on page 160, you couldn't actually verify what it says. So it's just a world of total insanity, like Roger Rabbit land or something like that, right? And so this is what they want people to believe, is that we live in a world of Roger Rabbit quantum physics nonsense. And so the whole idea is to break people's self-esteem and trust for their own five senses to be able to go out and verify and look up citations and know the truth for themselves on each specific topic. Now, some people come up and say, you can't know the truth. Well, what they're doing is, this is known as the lesser to the greater fallacy. I can know that 1 + 1 is 2. I can look at and verify that that is true. I can look up a citation in a book, verify that that is true. And then what they'll do is they'll take that to, well, you can't know the grand truth of the whole universe. So therefore, we should just speculate out our butts all day about anything that comes to mind. And this is, people that refuse to look at facts and information, refuse to read things before they judge them. Typically, what they'll do from there is they fall back on channeling and this kind of behavior for any information, and then they have a collapse in self-esteem, and they end up not trusting themselves, and that's really the intended goal of all of that.
Yes, the idea that knowledge is all subjective and there's no one universal truth obviously aids and abets those in power, because then if there's no such thing as truth, we can never discern what they're doing, can we?
It's true that Joshua Blakeney is interviewing me right now, and next week or whenever he'll put it out, and then his audience will be able to go there and download it and play it. Now, how did they know that?
Yeah.
How did you and I know that at 12 o'clock today, we'd start an interview? Wow. I mean, this goes back to that who, what, where, and when. And this is what they don't want people to focus on. And so what people think is that, like, you know, the experience that you have on psychedelics, which I have done psychedelics many hundreds of times. I'm not like somebody who he just doesn't get it. He's never tried them before. That's one of the first ad hominem attacks that these New Agers will throw out. They try to attack me rather than the information, you know.
Yeah.
He's never done them. What's that?
We're going to have to go to the first break, yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the second segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney, and I'm still here with the inimitable Jan Irvin of GnosticMedia.com. Prior to the break, we were talking about the problem of relativism. Jan mentioned Einstein, and of course, we associate the word relativity with his theorem. And there has been, Jan, hasn't there, this radical promotion of cultural relativism thanks to Franz Boas.
Franz Boas and Aldous Huxley and Aleister Crowley and Tim Leary, you know, they all sell moral relativism. You know, there is no good or bad. You know, and the whole purpose of that is to break society, you know, but I'll let you ask your question before I tell the whole tale.
Yeah, so we have cultural relativism, moral relativism. There's epistemic relativism, the idea that epistemology is merely a product of one's paradigm and there are no universal epistemological standards by which we can appraise the truth value of statements.
Yeah, so, this is all created by the sophists, essentially.
Yeah. So, and the Frankfurt School were very instrumental in this, and some have concluded that the Frankfurt School was a sort of Jewish intellectual movement. Obviously, you know, it goes without saying that not every single Jew on planet Earth agrees with the opinions of the Frankfurt School or with people like Franz Boas, who was also Jewish. But there are some who would analyze this as a sort of attack on Western civilization, and attempt to undermine.
Sorry to interrupt you there, and I should say that members of the Frankfurt School were guys like Karl Marx and George Wilhelm Hegel, where we get the Hegelian dialectic. Wilhelm Reich, that promoted the so-called sexual revolution, was out of there. And then ideas like neo-feudalism and the New Age movement and student movements, and these ideas actually came out of the Frankfurt School. Now, I tried to find a paper that someone sent me and I lost it, but the top members of the Israeli government, I wish I had found that paper first, admit that there is zero difference between, Zio-racism or Zionism and communism. And of course, the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution in Russia killed 66 million plus people. And of course, they have kept the entire focus on what Hitler did since World War II to keep the focus off of what the Jews actually did in Russia. And so, there is this whole cover up there with that. But, one thing that I have found in researching MKUltra, which I found very startling at first, was that at least, and we're always told that MKUltra was, it came out of Germany. It was all the Germans and these German researchers and all of this stuff. But when you actually look at the MKUltra researchers and their backgrounds, even the ones that came out of Operation Paperclip, at least 50, maybe upwards to 70% of them were Jewish and not German backgrounds. And what's interesting is I only know of one or two Chinese and Japanese MKUltra researchers, no Latino researchers, no Black researchers, and maybe 20-30% Anglo-American type, British also, and then one Egyptian doctor. And so, when you look at this, it's rather startling because, obviously Judaism is supposed to only compose 3% of the population, somewhere in there, but yet 50 to 70% of the MKUltra researchers have this one specific background. And, that is a bit frightening, but when we get in and we look at Zio-racism and the Talmud and all of this stuff, the Talmud is very clear that Gentiles aren't so-called humans or real men, and that only Jews are. And then you understand from there why so many Jews were involved in the human experiments, because the Talmud says that they're allowed to experiment on other people, which they don't consider human.
Yeah, like when you read the works of Frankfurt School authors like Adorno and Horkheimer, I mean, I would call Karl Marx, I would define Marx as being somewhat separate to the Frankfurt School, who were neo-Marxists, whereas Karl Marx was the originator of Marxism. And
my point was that he greatly influenced the Frankfurt School. Even if they came up with neo-Marxism, it was still largely influenced by him. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and these Jewish authors in the Frankfurt School, they were obsessed with preventing Holocaust 2.0, preventing National Socialism or Gentile unification.
What do you mean when you say Holocaust 2.0? Because
you have to define what Holocaust 1.0
right.
was.
I mean, are you talking about what the Bolshevik Jews did in Russia, or what do you mean by that? Are you talking about Dresden? I'm not sure. So
yeah, well, obviously they presupposed the official narrative of the so-called German Holocaust, which, as we know, many scholars like David Irving and Friedrich Tauben and others have brought into question. Jürgen Graf and others have questioned and have in many instances refuted claims of. But anyway, from their point of view, they wrote in terms of, Auschwitz. Like, I think I read a phrase by Horkheimer and it said, all sociology should be informed by the experience of Auschwitz from now on. And in fact, Kevin MacDonald has a quote from an Israeli historian who called sociology a Jewish religion and called the Frankfurt School a Jewish sect. So there's no doubt this was heavily influenced by Jews. And I mean, the thing is, you have to understand what happened in National Socialist Germany. Basically, Jews were dislodged from power, right? Jews were disempowered because Gentiles in Germany, or the German ethnic group, was able to unify. And I think what they did was study what enabled Germans to unify. And you had the patriarchal family, the church, strong ethnocentrism. The Frankfurt School had this F scale, the fascist scale, by which they gauged the extent to which someone was fascistic, and they did surveys, and if someone said they were patriotic or they loved their flag or whatever, that would be an indicator of being fascistic. And so this whole
sorry to interrupt you. Meanwhile, Israel is one of the most fascist countries in the world, where interracial marriage is disallowed, where the country's under apartheid, where every year they bomb their neighbors that they stole the land from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because they, have this stuff written down in a book that their own priests wrote down 2,000 years ago, they think that it gives them automatic right to land that the Palestinians have lived on for 1,500 years or 1,000 years,
Yeah, so my point is, though, that I think that all the phenomena that you identify, whether it's the destabilization of the family, the attack on health and nutrition, which we'll come to later, or this attempt to inebriate people overtly with drugs and alcohol, that all of this is clearly an attempt to prevent people unifying in the way that they did in Germany, and therefore ensuring the hegemony of a certain group in the long term. Would that be a fair way to describe things? Oh,
I would say for sure. And it appears that there is really some sort of unification between the elite Anglos, from England, and the leading Jewish factions as well. And they seem to be working the same agenda. And so it's for that reason, it's very important that we expose Zio-racism and, all of this stuff, and expose all of the anti-Germanicism, et cetera, that's been promoted in the media and elsewhere. I mean, obviously when we get in and we look at MKUltra and we see, who are really involved, then we have the purpose of constantly blaming Germany for MKUltra in the USA that was run largely by Jewish researchers.
Yeah, Veronica Clark has debunked this in her research because she says basically all these people say is look at Operation Paperclip, where you had these German, very intelligent scientists told, well, you can either go to jail or you can come and have a reasonable life in America working on our different science programs. And from that isolated occurrence of a handful of German doctors coming over to the States, all the crimes of the CIA subsequently are pinned on as if this is an extension of National Socialist Germany in America.
Sure.
Right?
And this is totally promoted by guys like Dave Emery, et cetera, too, constantly. The whole CIA and everything, it's because the Nazis infiltrated us. But when you actually get in and you look at many of the names of the researchers that were brought in under Operation Paperclip, many of them were Jewish, not German. In fact, I would say a very large proportion of them were Jewish.
Yes. So perhaps we can now get into some of the etymological roots of some of the phrases that people are familiar with. I mean, you in your article, basically, as you said at the beginning, it's an etymological journey through the different definitions of drugs and so on that in terms of marketing these narcotics, right? And of course, here we come across Edward Bernays, who sort of seems to pop up in all these nefarious things, be it fluoride or promoting wars like the coup in
Aldous Huxley. As does Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond actually created most of the words. And if we look at the official history is originally they were called schizophrenogens, these psychedelic drugs were. And then the CIA named them psychotomimetic. And so then Huxley and Osmond had to come up with the right name, and boy, they were really troubled over this. And then they came up with psychedelic, and then Timothy Leary ruined that name, and then Gordon Wasson and Carl Ruck and Jonathan Ott in 1979 they came up with entheogen because Leary was such a bad guy and ruined the whole thing. I actually proved this whole line as completely false. Through primary citations. So in 1953, Osmond and Hoffer, and I think with the help of Smithies, it's in my paper there, they created the word hallucinogen. And then, and what's interesting is they go back and forth between the words they use for the public and between themselves. And then in 1957, Huxley creates phenerethyme, and then Osmond creates psychedelic in letters between each other as they're writing to each other, and they're talking about what a problem the name is for these substances. And it was also Humphrey Osmond who came up with psychotomimetic, and also in 1957. And when you read all of the literature on psychedelics, they'll say, they never talk about who actually created any of these words. They never cite the actual documents and citations and conversations where the words were created, except the one letter between Huxley and Osmond. Like, they don't admit that Osmond also created psychotomimetic, also created hallucinogen, also created psychedelic. Okay? And then they don't admit that Hoffer and Smithies and Huxley were all and Osmond were all working as a team together, and that they all came up with those words that are all still in use today. Psychotomimetic has fairly well fallen out, but then even a decade after these very same people stopped using these words, we see, or so-called stopped using them, we see them later on publishing articles and books under those same words. So in in 1967, I'm just looking it up here, in a book called The Hallucinogens, we have Hoffer and Osmond 10 years later, after they've created psychedelic and psychotomimetic, going back to their earlier word hallucinogen. And then, Osmond says that he felt that his word psychotomimetic was especially applicable and that it really applied. And so what we have is this whole scandal where we have 3 or 4 of these guys that create all of the names for them, all of the earlier names, and there were actually two teams, and then they pretend that other people created these names, and then they attack these imaginary other people who were actually themselves. And then in 1979, with Gordon Wasson and Professor Carl Ruck and Jonathan Ott and Daniel Staples, etc., they create the word entheogen, and then they create this huge lie behind their reason for doing so, and they state that, you know, it was Tim Leary's fault. What they don't state is that Tim Leary reported to Gordon Wasson, and Tim Leary admits that all of his research that he did at Harvard was reported directly to Wasson, who is a director of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. And again, you know we have Wasson's letters. We even have Wasson's letter requesting the $2,000 from the Gestechter Fund, and so we know that Wasson was a key MK Ultra guy. And, so anyway, it's just this whole song and dance. And, it was such a mind-blowing story. As I began to uncover it, you could just see how these same two teams created all of the names. They attack each other in this pseudo-language. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're all working together.
So this idea was basically, if they didn't want, they couldn't imagine people on the streets of San Francisco peddling their schizophrenogens,
right,
which promised to give you schizophrenia. So they changed the name to something that was less unattractive.
Could you imagine the whole psychedelic revolution of the 60s being, the psychotomimetic revolution, the psychosis mimicking revolution?
Yeah.
I mean, it just would have never taken off, right?
Yeah, so if basically the product gives you schizophrenia or messes up your mind in other ways and destabilizes you, but they wanted to sell it and make it attractive. And you talk in your article about how they organized some big event with pop stars in England.
Well, Michael Hollingshead was told by Timothy Leary to get back to England and to give them the new set and setting, because in England, nobody was having a spiritual or mystical experience. Now, how is it that in a whole country, nobody has that experience? And what's interesting is I find all of these quotes, like there's a quote from Dr. Oscar Janiger, and he's talking about he says, I'll just read you the whole quote here, and this is from a conversation on LSD 1979 that people can find on YouTube. He says, Leary says, right, and Ivan, of course. Then there was the coolness of the Los Angeles cells, or whatever you want to call it, but they kept, and then Sidney Cohen says, would you mind not calling it a cell? Let's call it a cluster. Then Larry says, all right, our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way, and it's every bit as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country. So he's identifying Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters as agents. And then Oscar Janiger says, yeah, and then Zinberg says that the visionary experience, and notice the last name there, the visionary experience and all of the things that he was doing at Harvard and the others, his residents and the rest he was giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or ecstatic or mystic experience. That the whole thing was a California invention, he said. And then Larry replies, wonderful, they're right. And then Janiger says, the only time it happened was when you crossed the Colorado River. And this is because of this naming and marketing. The reason why nobody ever had a mystical or religious experience at Harvard was because they were calling them schizophrenogens and psychotomimetics. But when Humphrey Osmond in 1960, we see Leary running the Harvard Psychedelic Research Project. And notice that by 1960, Leary is using that name, psychedelic. And so he had managed to recruit more than 40 doctors and several hundred students under using this new name. So then we see that the use of the new name was successful. Okay, so then after the creation of the new name is suddenly when people start having ecstatic and mystical type experiences. Now, a lot of people will argue, well, this is way after Native Americans and the Sufis and all of this stuff. So obviously, these groups were using it for spiritual purposes long before the CIA. But what we have to understand is that when we get how these substances are used for control, we understand that even as I read that quote from Arlene de Rios earlier, even in these cultures, somebody figures out how they actually cause hypersuggestibility and then uses them for this purpose. It doesn't matter whether it's the ancient Sufis or the Eleusinian mysteries or the Native American use of peyote, which really didn't kick up until 1860, or, we could go to like the Huichol in Mexico. And all of this is all about the inculcation of the youth into the culture. Now, being an ethnomycologist and ethnobotanist myself for years, I did believe in the so-called true religiosity of the psychedelic experience. But when I got in and began to look at how they marketed it using the names and the terms and telling people they should be having a religious experience, then it all started coming together for me and how these substances really worked. Now, like with the instance, or for instance, with magic mushrooms, Maria Sabina actually came out and tried to expose Wasson for falsely selling mushrooms as a religious experience. So, in other words, the Mazatec Indians in Oaxaca, Mexico, never used them for spiritual purposes. Maria Sabina is very clear about this, and I've exposed how in the article, if people want all of the detail, all of the quotes there, they can read the whole thing and see how this scandal was done. But she says, in a book that she wrote with Alvaro Estrada in 1981, and of course she only spoke Mazatec, she didn't read or write, so Alvaro Estrada edited the book for her. But she says, after those first visits of Wasson, many foreign people came to ask me to do vigils for them. I asked them if they were sick, but they said no. They said they had only come to know God. They brought innumerable objects with which they took what they called photographs and recorded my voice. Later, they brought papers, newspapers, and magazines in which I appeared. I kept some papers I'm in. I keep them, though I don't know what they say about me. It's true that Wasson and his friends were the first foreigners to come to our town in search of the saint children, and that they didn't take them because they suffered from any illness. Their reason was that they came to find God. Before Wasson, nobody took mushrooms only to find God. They were always taken for the sick to get well. And then she further states, further on in the book, for a time there came young people of one and the other sex, long-haired with strange clothes. They wore shirts of many colors and used necklaces. A lot came. Some of these young people sought me out for me to stay up with the little ones who spring forth. We come in search of God, they said. It was difficult for me to explain to them that the vigils weren't done from the simple desire to find God, but were done with the sole purpose of curing the sickness that our people suffer from. So, she is very clear that the mushrooms were never used for spiritual purposes. Wasson had manufactured a religion ahead of time that he then went down into Oaxaca, Mexico, seeking somebody that he could then apply this prefab religion that he created onto. So he committed anthropological heresy. He was an academic fraud. It appears that most of the people who worked with him were also academic frauds. And, I've requested that an investigation be done on Professor Carl Ruck at Boston University for academic fraud because of his involvement in this scandal. And in fact, I've caught him in other scandals. I caught him doing the same thing in a book that I published in 2008 called The Holy Mushroom. And he and his co-author, Mark Hoffman, had fudged a bunch of citations there too. But, so these guys, they basically manufactured this whole religion that they then applied onto Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina writes this book trying to expose them with Alvaro Estrada. And then what Wasson did was, in the English version of the book, he wrote the introduction to thwart her efforts against him. So, Wasson was just a really dirty guy. And I should mention that Wasson was also the vice president for J.P. Morgan Bank, in charge of public relations. And ironically, he was close friends with Edward Bernays for at least a decade.
Wow, a real man of the people to ignite a grassroots revolution, eh?
Oh, yeah. Well, exactly. And so when we get into weaponized anthropology, which was which was coined by Gregory Bateson, who is another involved in Project MK Ultra. He and his wife, Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, they were both MK Ultra. So he came up with this idea, native revivalism, which was basically to collide cultures back into each other. So, what Bateson does, he says, what the Russians have done is to stimulate the native peoples to undertake a native revival, which became the archaic revival since his time by Terence McKenna, et cetera, while then they themselves admire the resulting dance festivals and other exhibitions of native culture. Literature, poetry, music, and so on. The system gets overweighted until some compulsory machinery or compensatory machinery is developed, and then the revival of its nature, etc., becomes a weapon for use against the white man. And this is out of a declassified OSS letter, which was, of course, the precursor to the CIA, from Gregory Bateson to the OSS. And so, and then Gregory Bateson also worked with Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond and Wass and all of these guys. He was also up at the Esalen Institute. The Esalen Institute up in Big Sur, California, has really been the fountainhead of promoting all of the MK Ultra New Age spirituality out to the public. And there's a few other similar organizations, but the Esalen Institute, which was co-founded by Aldous Huxley and Gerald Heard, that's really the key one where they, promote all of their degenerating, garbage.
Yeah, I don't like to truncate what you're saying, Jan, but we have to go to the second break of this episode of The Real Deal. This is really fascinating. Of course, Margaret Mead was the protege of Franz Boas, and her theories about Samoa and her study in Samoa has been debunked now as having also been academic fraud. But we'll have to go to the break, as I say, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll be back in a jiffy. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the third segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney, and I'm still here with Jan Irvin of GnosticMedia.com. And prior to the break, we were discussing Margaret Mead. She, along with Franz Boas, helped to ignite this relativistic idea that all cultures are equal. And you did cite a quote, Jan, suggesting or arguing that this was something to do with undermining the white man. In my next radio show, I'm going to be interviewing Professor Duchesnay from a university in the east of Canada, who's written a book on the uniqueness of Western civilization. And, the truth is that, like the West, we did evolve exponentially, and we developed very unique methods in science and knowledge and so on that other cultures didn't develop. And that's why we advanced in a way that other societies didn't. And it seems that anthropology and all the different phenomena we're discussing was largely about undermining that and preventing Western peoples from being successful.
Well, let me just interject there, because it's not, anthropology isn't just against the Western people. Anthropology, like if you look at Bartholomew Dean's book, The Urarina Society, he goes in and he studies the Urarina culture of northern Peru in order to break them and destroy them. He's showing how they can be basically inculcated into the West, because every time anybody had attempted before to study them and break them, they disappeared further into the Amazon jungle. We can see Wasson doing this against the Mazatec by slamming the Mazatec into white culture. We can see this being done against the Native Americans. We can see the Russians did it against the Siberians, etc. So they use it against all cultures, really. And this is, probably 60% of, and that's, I've heard a number somewhere. I don't have the exact number. I just made that one up. But very many anthropologists are actually on the pay of the intelligence and military community for these exact reasons. But the letter that I quoted you previously before the break was from Gregory Bateson, who is an anthropologist. He was the husband of Margaret Mead. He was an OSS agent. And the original FOIA request that got that letter released was by Professor David H. Price, who wrote the book Weaponizing Anthropology. And so he's the one that found that. And then when we see that Gregory Bateson worked at the Esalen Institute, where people like Terence McKenna also worked, who came up with the native revivalism theory, we can see the exact origins of this thing. They all work together there, and then they just, it's just different versions of the, mind control and disinformation program. So, Gregory Bateson, though, his wife, Margaret Mead, she, and you mentioned Franz Boas earlier, but she was also influenced by Bronislaw Malinowski, and he trained at the London School of Economics, where, ironically, Gordon Wasson also trained at. He was at the University of Leipzig. He was under Wilhelm Wundt, etc. And when we go under Wilhelm Wundt, we see a lot of these same guys there, like John Dewey, who helped create the current education system. We see came out of Wilhelm Wundt, as did the PhD system. Edward Bernays studied under Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, so it's as did Ivan Pavlov. So we get this small little circle of these people. But Margaret Mead, she's just dirty as hell. She and her husband both worked on Changing Images of Man, version 1 and version 2, which a lot of the new religion was sold upon. And in fact, if you look up the book Changing Images of Man, and the 1974 version is very rare. In fact, several months ago, I bought the last copy that was available anywhere I could find on the internet. But that is a project that they worked on out of the Stanford Research Institute, and Joseph Campbell was also a key player in that. And Joseph Campbell, he created the mythology and the new religion that they would sell with MK Ultra and the counterculture. And we can actually see them doing this in this book, Changing Images of Man. And then there's a 1982 version where it's very heavily edited and very different from the original, but most people can get a hold of that copy. And Changing Images of Man the project was headed up by another MK Ultra doctor by the name of Willis Herman. And then we also see, and I mentioned James Fadiman earlier. He was a part of that project. Margaret Mead, again, Henry Marganeau, John Platt, even Sir Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, was a part of that project. But all of these things feed back into the ongoing aspects of the MK Ultra program.
And it seems largely this is about creating a sort of Descartesian mind-body split and creting anthropocentric...
a dichotomy. Yeah, what they want to do is, see, Aldous Huxley, he was actually insane. Most people don't realize that. They think he was this great genius. He was a sociopath. He's actually one of the two worst sociopaths I've ever studied, period. The other worst sociopath, who was just a murderer, he murdered 45 million people, was Leon Trotsky. And I would put Aldous Huxley in that category or that level of sociopathy. I mean, Trotsky just had the Russian population murdered flat out. Aldous Huxley basically created mind control systems to dumb down the entire population, to kill them through soft eugenics. So Aldous Huxley was maybe a little bit wiser in his methods, but both of them had the exact same goal in mind.
I think that's really interesting that you said that, because I've often said this, that I think that the people who attempted to foist a sort of ethnocide on the people of Russia, that they realized at some point that they were being too obvious and too overt by just sort of rounding up dissidents and throwing them in the gulag.
Well, they didn't just throw them in the gulag, though. But I mean, between Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, they had at least 66 million people murdered.
Yeah, but I think what we're discussing manifested itself in the capitalist West is this psychological warfare where they wanted to persuade people to consent to their own servitude.
And we have to realize, too, that Trotsky was almost entirely funded by the United States. So, they were probably just, comparing both methods.
Yeah.
But so getting back, and now I lost the other point. So when Oh, geez. We're segueing way too far, and I'm going to lose my train of thought. I don't want to deal with that. So anyway, the issue here is that, okay, so you were talking about Huxley's, dichotomy. So Huxley actually had severe dissociative disorder. And the dissociative disorder his insanity is actually where the entire transhumanism crap is that was later promoted by Julian Huxley and is promoted by these clowns like Ray Kurzweil at Google, etc. This is all based on dissociative disorder. Now, dissociative disorder in Psychology 101 is basically a symptom of extreme insanity. But so Aldous Huxley, and probably Julian and obviously Kurzweil and all of these clowns, they actually think that their body is separate from their mind, that there's not a holistic, unification of the two. And so in Huxley's letters, we actually see in one of his letters, we see him writing to his nephew or somebody, I forget, it's not in front of me, about his mental breakdowns and about how, the mind is just so easy to take care of, but I don't understand taking care of this body stuff. And he talks about his body as if it's another person. So this is a clear sign that he's totally what crazy. And, so then we have the entire MK Ultra, or not entire, but he was a key architect of the MK Ultra program. He's involved in all of this MI6 and CIA stuff, and he's totally schizophrenic, totally dissociative disorder, totally sociopathic, and this is the insanity that the intelligence community based this on. Now, also, I should point out that the idea of the New World Order comes primarily from Aldous Huxley and the Brave New World. And Aldous Huxley's book, The Brave New World, wasn't a warning. It was a guidebook. It was the blueprint for how to do that. And then he goes around on TV in Berkeley and all of this stuff. We got to, warn people it's coming. But he never admits that he was actually one of the architects behind it. So that's the gag, and all of these guys that are architects, they would go on TV and warn it, like Eisenhower, President Eisenhower goes on TV and warns of the military-industrial complex. Well, he was working behind the scenes with Aldous Huxley and Gordon Wasson at the Century Club. So that's kind of the gag. You go out into the media and you say, it's happening. I'm warning you people, it's going on. But they don't say, but I'm, orchestrating it. So they never take responsibility. They just say it's going to happen, and then they're touted all over the media as being these wonderful geniuses. But really, they're just, they're psychopaths. They're really severely mentally ill. I mean, even Trotsky, for instance, like half his brain was actually rotten in his head. When they autopsied him, like half his brain was missing.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
I mean, what I was just going to say, though, was that I think there was a realization at some point that you can't just do what the Bolsheviks did, which is just basically kill or starve to death or work to death those who disagree with you. What you have to do is this immense propaganda, psychological warfare offensive.
It's not an either or thing, though, Josh. It's an also and. This Zio-racism, communism, Bolshevism, whatever you want to call it, it's the exact same thing, okay? And whether they're murdering people in Palestine or in Russia or, feeding people wheat in a low-fat diet here, it's all the same thing. Under the Talmud, as long as the murder is committed by proxy, then they can't be blamed for it. That's their ideal. If you can get somebody else to do it, or if you push somebody into a river and then the river drowns them, it was the river that committed the murder, not you. That kind of mentality,
Yeah, but I think what makes your job much harder than, say, Solzhenitsyn's job was that when you live in a sort of overt tyranny, it's a lot easier to diagnose. Whereas with you, you can be dismissed as this wacko conspiracy theorist.
Well, sure. This is the point why we offer the trivium and critical thinking, so that people don't rely on fallacies and you're wrong because is the foundation of their argument. That's the entire purpose of creating the trivium method meme, is to couple the information with critical thinking so that people regain the self-esteem to trust their own five senses again, to go in and verify the citations, and then they can know the truth.
And of course, if you take all these narcotics, then you're going to lose your five senses, aren't you? Which is the opposite of the spirit of the trivium method.
Well, yeah, and that's the idea though. But really, it causes hypersuggestibility, and that's what writing this last article really brought forth, and reviewing all of their material and quotes for the article. I mean, the article is really about a half a book, and I had a real dilemma for about 6 months over whether or not I was going to publish it in a book or, put it out on the internet for free. And so many people were writing me about the issue and not understanding it, et cetera, that I figured it was urgent, and I just decided to put it out for free. But just so your audience knows, most of my show and what I do is run on donations. So, we need to recoup putting out, many months of writing for free through donations. So all of your listeners, please go to the Gnostic Media website and donate.
And one segment of your oeuvre that I've enjoyed the most has been your work on nutrition. There should be a photo of me on your website saying, I listened to Jan Irvin and lost 300 pounds. No, I definitely have got off the wheat ever since I listened, for example, to your interview with William Davis, author of Wheat Belly.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain to the listeners how there's been this attack on, we've spoken about the attack on the mind. How has there been an attack on the body through malnutrition?
And even there's been an attack on William Davis for publishing that book, and they're trying to make it just about celiac, which it's not. They want to control the whole focus. All of the bad, or nearly all of the bad LDL cholesterol that we get in our diets comes from grains, okay? Not from meat, not from butter, not from eggs. It comes from grains, and especially from wheat and bread. And most of the diabetes comes from wheat, bread, grains again, because, if you eat 2 slices of bread, for instance, it's equivalent to about a tablespoon of sugar. And wheat also contains natural Valium, and it contains a opium-like substance, gluteomorphine, I think is what they call it. And so, when most people stop eating wheat after about 10 days to 2 weeks, they feel a fog actually lift off their brains. And so when we look at the whole mental health industry and, peddling antidepressants and Prozac and Seroquel and all of this kind of crap, we can see that that keeping people on wheat is part of the agenda of keeping people on the pharmaceutical drugs at the same time. Now, so part of the campaign against Davis, like I mentioned, they try to make it look like, it's not just celiac. A lot of people can eat celiac just fine or eat wheat just fine. But there's other things in wheat, like for instance, if you eat whole grain wheat actually has loads of phytic acid in it, which is the same stuff that makes raw spinach poisonous and raw kale poisonous. And it's also the substance that's why you rinse beans overnight before you cook them, to get rid of the phytic acid. And phytic acid is pretty bad for you. It can cause kidney stones, it can cause all kinds of internal problems, etc. But almost any benefit that you would gain from eating whole grain wheat is countered by the phytic acid. So that's another issue that they don't talk about.
Yeah, and one of the fallacies, isn't it, the case that fat doesn't make you fat? Like people say, I'm going to eat low-fat products because that will reduce my fat.
Low-fat products are actually far more toxic for you, and they're a lot more processed. In fact, most people, when you go to the grocery store, if you just avoid all of the processed foods, and one way you can identify the processed foods is almost all of them have a kosher stamp on it, where you pay Israel to commit genocide on Palestine and other countries. So one of the best ways you can also boycott Israel is to stay out of the middle of the grocery store and not stop buying, processed foods and packages, because most of that stuff you're paying a tax to Israel for. So, if you get out of the processed foods and all of this stuff, you can begin to, regain your health. But the low-fat diet, the whole thing with that, and they've sold it backwards to us. And so what's really going on here, which people, and somebody must have figured this out at least by the 1920s or 30s, but there's 2 systems of energy that the body runs on. There's one system called glycolysis, and there's another system called ketosis. Now, when you run on glycolysis, this is basically, you would want to run on glycolysis, say, if there is a famine, or if if there's a fight or flight type situation, you want to be under glycolysis. The rest of the time, you want to be under ketosis. But what they've done is, at least since the creation of the Dust Bowl and planting millions and millions of acres or hectares, whatever you want to call it, of wheat in the 1920s and 30s in the plains area of the United States. Ever since then, they basically kept everyone in a constant or perpetual state of glycolysis. Now, the liver has two portions. One, so the glycolysis is essentially your body is running on sugars and carbohydrates and glucose. And so whenever you eat wheat and grains and sugary fruits and things like this, you're pretty much forcing your body into glycolysis. But if you don't eat those kind of foods, and let me back up a second. If you stay in glycolysis, what happens is every year that you're in it, your body decreases in its ability to metabolize the glucose as well as it did before. So the longer you're in glycolysis, the heavier you get, the less energy you have, the higher your risk of diabetes, skin problems, mental problems, irritable bowel syndrome, all of this stuff. All of this falls under you staying in a constant state of glycolysis and never coming out of it. Like I said, it's supposed to be like for famine, like you would eat your store of grain for like 3 months if there were no rains to feed the cattle or something. And, so you would want to be in it then, or if, your body automatically switches over to glycolysis when you're in a state of fight or flight, because you need that instant boom of energy. But, you're not supposed to be in that state of fight or flight for 50 years, okay? So your body's ability to handle it breaks down. So then by the time you hit your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, you begin to have obesity, diabetes problems, mental problems, you're depressed all the time, you don't feel good. It's because you're eating the wheat and the grains and you're constantly in the state of glycolysis. And so what happens, though, is if you go over to ketosis is when your body, after 2 to 3 weeks of giving your body a high-fat diet, for instance, like Dave Asprey promotes the bulletproof coffee, et cetera. If you have, I drop 3 ounces of butter in my coffee every morning for the last almost 3 years now.
Grass-fed butter, right?
Of course, it has to be the grass-fed stuff. You don't want this, industrial, farmed meat and butter and stuff. Stay away from that stuff. And in fact, if you try to put this factory-farmed butter from grain-fed cows into your coffee, it tastes absolutely horrible. You'll gag on it. So if you don't have grass-fed butter, it tastes horrendous. And that's, when you first go on to like the bulletproof coffee thing and you're trying a cheap butter and you just go, and you go, wow, that's awful. And so that's one of the first cues you'll have as to how bad this grain-fed meat and stuff really is. And speaking of that, why do they feed cows grain to begin with? Well, let's break it down here. It's really simple. Okay, so they want to reduce the time from the cow or the steer bull is born to the time it's slaughtered as much as they can. So by feeding the animals grain instead of grass like they naturally eat, they can slaughter the animals in 1 year. A cow, a bison, a bull that's fed grass takes at least 2 years. Okay, and so what they've done by feeding the cattle grain is they've fattened them up and made them, and they fatten them until the point that the animal is sick. Right before it gets sick, they slaughter it. So if you compare this to human society, you look around you, all of the fat people and everything in American society, this is directly because of this. I mean, they're feeding the population grains just like they do the cattle. Okay, so when you switch over to the ketosis state, your body learns to burn cholesterol and fat. Now, here's another issue that they don't want people to know. While they're pumping out all those statin drugs, all of the Lipitor and all of that stuff, well, the joke is that your brain is about 70 to 77% cholesterol or hydroxycholesterol, and it burns on saturated fat. So, and then the other part that burns cholesterol and saturated fats the most is your reproductive system. So obviously they're attacking, number one, your brain, number two, your ability to reproduce. So if you're on a low-fat diet, your body thinks it's in a famine, and then it has problems reproducing. So if you get yourself, if you know the women out there who are trying to get pregnant, want to have a family, if you're having trouble, get yourself out of glycolysis and into ketosis. And once you're in ketosis for a few months, you'll be very likely easily able to conceive if you're having trouble now. And so this is really, the whole layer. But when you're in ketosis, your mental clarity is far greater. Like, if I'm in a state of glycolysis, I can chain like 15 thoughts together without having a brain fart. Whereas when I'm in a state of ketosis, I can chain like 60 thoughts together. So you can actually think much more clearly. You have a lot more energy. And when you're in a state of ketosis, you don't have these ups and downs all day. So this is another reason why it's important to not put sugar and things like that in your coffee. Instead of putting sugar in your coffee, you should put, 2 or 3 ounces of grass-fed butter in your coffee, and then you'll have 5 to 6 hours of solid, smooth, clean energy, no ups or downs, and all of this stuff like you would normally have from coffee. And also, you should also be roasting your own coffee. Get good green coffee beans. If you ever get the jitters from coffee, or if you get like nausea from coffee, it's because your coffee is rancid. It's bad. And I can't actually drink any coffee from the grocery stores. In fact, I didn't even drink coffee until I started roasting my own, because the coffee in the stores is so bad, and I would always feel like crud, when I drank it. But as soon as I started roasting my own and throwing it away after 5 or 6 days, I totally stopped having any further problems with coffee.
Okay, well, maybe we'll take the third break of this episode of The Real Deal, Jan. And when we come back after the break, we can continue discussing nutrition and health, because I think it's such an important subject. So I think we'll go to the break now, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be back shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the fourth and final segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney of nonalignedmedia.com, and I'm still here with Jan Irvin of gnosticmedia.com. And prior to the break, he had broached the issue of health and nutrition, and we were discussing the importance of eating a high-fat, low-grain diet, which is, of course, the opposite of what the government health regulators tell us to do. I was recently in Japan, Jan, and they produce cattle very diligently there. And like the ideal meat for them would be where they've raised the cows, often eating like apples and lots of grass, definitely not grain. They massage a lot of the cows, so the fat goes through the meat, and their kind of perfect beef to have is thinly sliced, like marbled beef that has lots of fat in it. So like
you're making me hungry.
Yeah, so like fatty meat, and that, for example, Matsusaka beef or Kobe beef is the highest form of beef there, and that's where it's rippled with lots of fat, right? And they have this sort of attitude that less is more, because they'd rather have a small amount of very high quality meat rather than having some like gigantic steak like we can get here in North America that's the product of a grain-fed cow. Right. That's very bad for you, right?
And it's fed in a feedlot rather than on a ranch eating grass. What makes me really sick is these vegans and vegetarians and PETA people that attack ranchers. And there's actually a really good book. All of you environmentalists out there and PETA people who think that eating cows and all that is bad. There's a really good book, "Cows Save the Planet." And shows how cows are actually the answer to the environmental problems. But, you see these environmentalists saying that cows are one of the worst, impacts on the environment that we have. It's not cows. The North American continent used to run wild with millions and millions of bison, but which were wiped out so that the beginning of factory farms could start there. And basically the entire continent had a massive supply of free, high quality beef with the bison, and they had to get rid of that. But this whole thing with the cattle, they're causing the problems. It's totally false. It's the factory farms. If they weren't shutting down ranchers and and constantly making ranchers and their jobs more difficult and making it harder to make money, we wouldn't have the problem. The problem is strictly a factory farms when infecting the groundwater and all of this stuff. This is factory farms. This isn't something that bison and cattle grazing on grass on the wild plains do. And in fact, the cattle eat the grass, they poop, the birds follow the cattle, they spread the seeds of the grass, and they actually stop deforestation and desertification, and then again you have a free, ready supply of food everywhere. But the bison certainly didn't cause the destruction of the North American environment. That's a load of crap.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is we're evolutionary animals and we evolved to eat certain things. Our ancestors ate certain things. And I know you've interviewed people like Sally Fallon who have discussed the paleo diet.
Sure.
And so like the vegan diet and vegetarianism, was that part of this regulated revolt, this counterculture, this attempt to foist dysgenics and weaken our people by making people eat what is not natural for them to be consuming?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I should say, to all your audience who's screeching right now about, the vegan vegetarian thing, I was vegan for about 6 years and vegetarian for about 6 years. It is an urban religion. It is found almost nowhere outside of cities where people do hard work. If you're in a state of glycolysis all the time, you cannot do hard physical labor. If you're in a state of ketosis, you can do labor all day long on a fat diet and you don't get tired. And so, the vegetarian vegan thing, it's definitely an urban religion. It's sold as a religion. You'll almost always hear the people who peddle veganism and vegetarianism using it as a moral high ground. And that's the first sign that it's a cult. Even people who I have a lot of respect for, like Mark Passio, will always use the moral high ground when they promote veganism and vegetarianism. And so that's always something to look out for. It's like, we don't give we have to care for the animals but not our own kids. Okay. So for instance, when you have a baby and the baby is born and the baby is properly breastfed, the baby is in a state of ketosis its entire childhood, or as it's growing up till about the age of 2 or 3. If you put it on soy formula and all of this crap, then it grows up in a state of glycolysis, which is not how babies are supposed to be raised. And not only that, but most of these formulas have a lot of soy in it. Soy has a lot of phytoestrogens in it, which wreak total havoc on the male system. And no male, period, should ever, ladies and gentlemen, eat soy, period. So get that into your heads. All of that soy milk, all of that soy cheese, all that processed crap that you pay a tax to Israel for, I mean, it's just junk. Stop eating it. It's not good for you. You're killing yourself. Anyway, there's my opinion, ladies and gentlemen.
And you and Sally Fallon discussed the edible oils conspiracy and the suppression of raw milk. Could you broach that for us?
Well, the vegetable oils were basically invented in the 1910s, and then in the early 1920s, as she's pointed out, and she did her work with Dr. Mary Innig, but they point out that the first heart attacks actually show up in the early 1920s, and they actually did tests early on showing, they would restrict people from eating a high-fat diet and putting them on vegetable oil. Most of the people that ate a high vegetable oil diet had heart attacks and died. Like half of them did, whereas like the group that ate a high saturated fat diet didn't. And, for the last 40 years, since like the 70s, early 80s especially, they've promoted this low-fat, low-salt diet thing. This is to keep everybody in a state of glycolysis, and that's what keeps you sick. That's what keeps you needing the pharmaceutical drugs. And by the way, I should say that I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a doctor. I've studied this stuff on my own. So, the FDA and all of the people who promote this food pyramid crap, anyway, they're poisoning everybody. In fact, recently South Park exposed the whole scandal. It's probably one of the best episodes of South Park ever. It's called Gluten-Free Ebola. And, the episode Cartman is having dreams about the pyramid is upside down, and it's the food pyramid. They flip it upside down at the end there. All the kids are eating butter pops and stuff like that. But, the food pyramid is actually upside down. Fats and meat should be number one. And, grains and sugars should be the least. Right now, they have grains and sugars as the foundation of the diet under the food pyramid. It's the most destructive diet that you can have. But going back to your earlier question, is this all intentional or whatever? We can actually go back all the way to Plato's Republic. In fact, on my website on GnosticMedia.com, people can listen to the episode recording of Will Durant talking about Plato's Republic, and in there he explains how they were promoting eugenics through the vegetarian diet in Plato's Republic. And so when you get that, you can see that it's the same thing that they're doing today. So what they do is they, like the elites, they create the overconsumption, all of these elites that promote all of the masses and all of this environmental policy, they have these huge mansions and they're doing all of this stuff. And they're the ones that cause most of the damages. Their factories and their pollution, their stuff that causes so much of the damage. They're the ones who got us on gasoline. And meanwhile, Europe has diesel hybrids that get 300 miles a gallon. It's all a big joke. But, we can see how they promote these things to the public when they're not actually doing them. And it's not to say we shouldn't take care of the environment. We should have hemp paper and hemp clothes and, sustainably renewable resources and fuel, et cetera. But, we shouldn't necessarily be listening to them and having the government handle all of our solutions. The government has prevented many different types of energy. I don't know if people want to think about Tesla technology and all that stuff, they can. But there's all of that, and then there's what the people are actually told, and then they're blamed for being the cause of it.
Yeah.
So,
and the milk, right? That you can get arrested in Canada and in many states in the U.S. for trying to sell raw milk as a farmer.
Sure.
Right?
Well, yeah. In fact, year before last, I think it was possibly in Michigan. They actually called the SWAT team out on two little girls, 11 and 12, who were selling raw milk from their cow.
Yeah, I think recently here in Canada, I looked into trying to get access to raw milk, and I'd heard rumors that you could buy a share in a cow, and that was one way people were getting around it. But then I read an article saying that a farmer had been arrested and criminalized for selling shares in a cow, because
right.
the rule was if you owned your own cow, then you could drink your own raw milk.
And the irony is that pasteurized milk is actually far more dangerous than raw milk. Raw milk, if it's clean, it just separates into its natural constituents. You get cheese and whey and all of this stuff as it ages. And then it's the pasteurized milk that actually spoils and has all of these problems. On occasion, you can get bacteria in raw milk like you can with pasteurized milk. But, most of the problems that people have with lactose intolerance and all this stuff come from pasteurized milk. That's because a chemical in the milk called lactate is destroyed in the pasteurization process, so then it makes them lactose intolerant because the two chemicals, lactose and lactate, work together. In raw milk, and I'm actually in my area, I'm able to buy raw milk from two different stores here, but they do raids on the farmers regularly. I mean, they'll bring in the full SWAT team. I mean, it's okay, farmers, stuff that comes from nature, stuff that we've eaten and survived on for millions of years. They actually think they have the authority to do SWAT raids with. This is the level of insanity in the culture. I mean, and a lot of this is Talmudic racist, Zio-racist nonsense, where they're getting this kind of stuff through. But they're attacking nature itself. They're attacking our ability to get foods that are not processed and therefore not poisonous. But whenever I drink raw milk, I feel great all day. If I drink pasteurized milk, I feel it in my stomach right away. It does not feel good. Even if it's the best organic stuff out there, if it's pasteurized, it's not whole, fresh milk as it's supposed to be. So this is actually why most people, if they do have trouble with milk, why they have trouble with milk, it's because it's pasteurized.
Yeah, I mean, I think the macro picture is that we are ruled by this hostile elite group that doesn't have kinship ties to the masses and wants to subjugate the masses. I mean, you can imagine a society that was organic and had a connection between the rulers and the ruled. They would be trying to foster health and so on.
It's more than that. It's a control issue. When you have factory farms and you can control the regulation of everything from nature itself, then you have total control on the masses. Whereas the antithesis of that, if everybody can grow their own hemp and have their own cow and their own chickens and all this stuff, well, guess what? You're able to self-sustain. You don't need the factory farms. You don't even care about the communist or socialist governments and and all of the regulations and all that stuff. The governments can rise and collapse. And if you have your own farm, your own food, your own garden, your own cows and chickens, etc., your own pigs, if you eat pork, you're not really going to even care if the government collapses. And if you add your extended family, your aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents to that scenario, then you have a self-sustaining perpetual system that goes on for centuries, and you don't care. And that's what they want to prevent.
And radical feminism, of course, has undermined what you just discussed, the family, the extended family, and so on. Oh,
sure. Well, and Gloria Steinem and all these. Gloria Steinem was a CIA agent, but feminism has been totally debunked. It's a total scam. It's just to divide, men and women. It's like, men suppressed women. Well, see, the issue is that nature creates natural divisions. Women are better at nurturing. Men are better at going out and hunting and hunting and bringing stuff in. Men are typically bigger and stronger. And so this created a natural division of labor. In fact, about a month and a half ago, I was at the local museum with my son, and they had a display there, how life was in the 1880s. And the women who were running the household display, they were like, oh, well, this was all women's work, and the women had to stay home, and they had to wash the clothes and cook all day and do all of this stuff. And, this was all women. And they took great pride in having all the little boys do laundry and all this stuff. I mean, they just were overjoyed by this. But what they never mentioned is that the men had to cut the trees to build the house, build them the house, make the nails, dig the well, source the food, bring all of that kind of stuff. So there was a natural division of labor. It wasn't like the men were just sitting around with the thumbs up their rears. But this is the image that the women wanted to portray. There was a balance, and because women nurture and provide birth, well, they were obviously provided for in the home. The men would bring the supplies to the women to nurture the children and themselves. That was the deal of how things have been going on for centuries. You don't see like lions and lionesses out on the African plains like suddenly stop and the lioness going, I'm not going to go milk the cubs, F you go do that.
Yeah.
It's
We're
only
getting a divorce.
Right. It's only something that happens in human culture, and we can see it in all animals where there's a sort of a natural division in labor. But Gloria Steinem and the CIA and the Zio racists, they thought it would be funny to create a false division between men and women. And so what happens is there is a collision within the home of what people should do, especially in the United States and Canada. If you go to like Japan, you can still see this clear division of labor. And if a man steps into the kitchen, the woman goes absolutely berserk. You see it in Europe still as well. I lived in Yugoslavia for a year and a half, and you can still see it there very clearly as well. And this is, actually a good thing. It's not that men are lazy or women are doing all the work or men are trying to get one up on women. We should have equality, but the division of labor is by nature, and it's there for the most supportive method of raising offspring. And that's why, of course, they want to interject that crap into society. Now, also, I've interviewed Girl Writes What, Karen Strauhan, a couple of times on my show, and she does, she's Canadian. She does a great job at exposing feminism as a complete fraud, and I recommend everybody study her work and how they've used feminism in attempt to destroy the family unit.
Yeah, we've got like laws here in Canada against gender discrimination. So even to question the idea that men and women are just interchangeable is quasi-criminal now. But yeah, in Japan, I've witnessed it where you have the husband who works like 350 days a year, and the women do some work in the home, but often meet their friends for coffee, sometimes go on holiday to Hawaii, and the husband stays in Tokyo doing all the work. Like actually they have it like better off than in this society. Women are compelled into the rat race. Like I think there's always going to be some women who are competent enough to be judges and all that, and who have that ambitiousness, and that's fine. There should be room for that. Whereas if some women are actually competent enough to be judges and lawyers,
but there's no, I mean, obviously the agenda here is to destroy the family unit. It's not to have just equality across the board. Equality across the board is one thing, but I mean, it's like fathers have no rights in courts. It doesn't matter the harm that a mother does to a child, if she's an alcoholic, if she lies out of her face to the judge or whatever to get custody. Typically in United States courts, they automatically decide with the mother, no matter how bad the mother is. And, crime reports, the lesbian couples have actually more violence than straight couples. So the idea that, that with a woman-only society that there would be less violence, it's absolutely false. Lesbian couples actually have quite a lot more violence than straight couples do.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think it's just wise to view historic trends through an evolutionary perspective of how we've evolved. Whether it comes to what we should eat, or how men and women should function in society, or even when it comes to taking drugs. Like our ancestors weren't necessarily taking these engineered narcotics en masse, right? There were probably some, but all these things just try and do what's natural. And there was an evolutionary biologist in Canada named Philip Rushton, who did studies relating to race, but he also did studies on gender. And he said, actually, it just so happens that all the IQ studies he conducted, that men have a higher mean IQ than women. That isn't to say there aren't some very intelligent women and some very stupid men, but on average, men had more people with high IQs than women did. And that was his explanation for why men often ended up being in more influential roles in society.
See, I disagree with that. I think it's pretty clear, you protected the women and children, and the women nurtured. You would create a home or the nest for the woman. The men would bring the supplies to the women, and the men would go out into the evil world where all of the corruption and all of the crap was, and they would deal with each other in that arena. But you protected the women at home, and the Muslim culture is very clear on this. And Muslim men, when you tell them that they're suppressing women, they look at you like you're crazy. Like, we worship our women. What are you, crazy?
Yeah.
But in our society, because they wear now I forget what it's called, the women wear the headdress. They think they're intentionally suppressing the women, but it's to keep, and of course they want to hypersexualize the Muslim culture and everything, because they want to break that family unit. And so, it's trying to squeeze, Steinem's feminist nonsense into Muslim culture is how they want to break that. Now, again, it's not saying that women shouldn't have equal rights and status in Muslim culture. It's saying that feminism is promoting a false dichotomy, a false division within the home, etc. And again, don't take my word for it, people. Study Karen Strouhan's work of Girl Writes What. Go to YouTube, type in Girl Writes What. She's got dozens of interviews of her research and everything, breaking all of this stuff down for everybody. It's a woman who's exposing all of this stuff. And get in there and look at all the research yourself. And, don't take my word for it. Look at the material. And but we can see how it's there to cause an unnatural division between men and women. It's to cause a hatred and a fight between the men and women, and to blame, men are the fault, and men are suppressing women, and women don't want to be in the home. Well, what's wrong with raising a family. I think personally that's the most noble thing that two people can do. I'm a parent, and and as I've grown up, I went from more liberal views when I was younger and seeing, researching all of this stuff, and then seeing it in hindsight and being a victim of it, going, wow, the psychedelic revolution was a fraud. Veganism and vegetarianism was a fraud. Feminism was a fraud, etc. And if we look at all of these things, it's to degenerate the society so that families and people can't work better. Let me put it this way. If you aren't married and you don't have your family and extended family there, if you're a single mother, you're probably reliant upon the state to do everything for you. That means you're a good little socialist, and you're probably not going to do anything to rock the boat if the state is doing something wrong. But you know what? If you have your extended family there, you have your cows, pigs, and chickens there, you have your own garden there, you're raising your own stuff, and you understand that, the guys are better at building the house and cutting the trees out of the forest to build whatever, and the women are better at raising the kids and making the food and doing all this stuff. It just makes a system that works, and it makes a system that makes you unreliant upon government and statism, and you become an adult rather than a child with an extended adolescence, a quote-unquote adult at 18, reliant upon the state to handle everything for you.
Yeah, well, we've got about a minute left on the show, Jan. Perhaps you could just discuss your website a little bit, your YouTube channel, and tell people how they can listen to more of your interviews and read more of your writings.
Sure. Well, my website is gnosticmedia.com. That's GNOSTIC media.com. And if they go up there right to the links on the top of the Gnostic Media website, you'll find my link to YouTube there. And also I run the triviumeducation.com website. That's TRIVIUM education.com. And people can learn more about that and how to get themselves out of this situation mentally. And when you study the trivium, it really becomes like a mental antivirus. You can spot lies coming at you, so then you can protect yourself and your family, your loved ones a lot better. I've done about, I think I'm on my 220th interview on my own show. I think this is probably like 228 interviews on other shows, such as yours. And most of that can be found up on the Gnostic Media website. And then I publish my own books. I also publish John Allegro's famous book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, et cetera. And all that can be found on the Gnostic Media store page. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we do function mostly on donations and what we sell from the store page. So your generous support and help is greatly appreciated.
Well, that was Jan Irvin, ladies and gentlemen, a sterling advertisement for the high-fat, low-grain diet and the bullet coffee, because you can see his brain is working very well. I've been Joshua Blakeney of nonalignedmedia.com, thanking Jan Irvin and thanking all of you for listening to another episode of The Real Deal.